Welcome back to the deep dive. You gave us this, well, massive, almost intimidating stack of source material.
Huh?
Everything from architectural history manuals to advanced real estate finance textbooks and even behavioral economics papers. It's quite the mix.
It really is. And, the sheer diversity of these sources tells us something important, I
It
think.
just,
Well, that to really grasp real estate, you can't just look at, say, market trends in isolation.
right.
You absolutely have to look at the physical buildings themselves, the regulations that shape them, the financial machinery that funds them.
And the human psychology driving all the decisions within that system.
Exactly. All of it together.
So our mission today is to take this incredible synthesis of knowledge you've provided and give you, the listener, a foundational but still really granular understanding of this whole ecosystem.
Yeah, the system governing where and how we live, how wealth gets built in this space, and how those big investment decisions actually get made.
And we're starting right at the beginning. The physical structures, the houses, the buildings. Okay, let's unpack this part first. Before, a single zoning law was written or a dollar was leveraged using some complex financial tool,
Mhm.
someone had to actually build a house.
That's right. And the architecture itself, the look and feel of our neighborhoods, it's a direct reflection. It mirrors historical periods, ideas about national identity, even shifting definitions of what success looked like.
It's fascinating how the sources point out these styles weren't just accidental looks.
No, not at all. They were very much explicit cultural statements. People chose them to show a certain place in society, or maybe a connection back to established European traditions, or sometimes a burgeoning sense of American pride.
So let's start with those big classical influences, the ones that really defined early American ideas of prestige.
Okay, so first up, we've got the American Georgian. This style really rose to prominence after about 1715.
Right.
It was essentially the high-status architecture for the colonial elite and then into the early Federalist period. It's deeply rooted in Stuart architecture from late 17th century England.
Okay, so what does that look like?
Think symmetry, like rigid, orderly facades, usually brick, balanced windows, maybe 5 across the front, very common, and a strong emphasis on a central hall inside.
Gotcha.
Examples like Westover in Virginia, built around 1734, or maybe the Corbett House in Delaware, they really capture that feeling of established, serious wealth in the colonies.
And that desire for grand classicism, it didn't just disappear, did it? It kind of got reinterpreted later on.
Exactly. It led to the neoclassical revival. That happened much later, sort of late 19th century, right into the mid-20th century.
And this one had a bit more philosophy attached.
Yeah, it did. It came with this philosophical overlay. It was associated with a sense of high cultural sophistication, this idea of paring things down, getting back to pure forms. There was this influential sculptor, Horatio Greeno, who really pushed for this kind of reduction. He believed if you just simplified the necessary parts of a design, beauty would just naturally emerge.
Interesting.
So these neoclassical homes, they project stability, order, and maybe a rejection of what they saw as the cluttered look of the Victorian era.
But speaking of grand, some people definitely rejected that whole paring down idea, right?
Yeah.
They used their homes as just massive displays of wealth.
Oh, absolutely. The sources definitely touch on these palatial palaces. These were the homes of the Gilded Age tycoons, designed not just for living, but really for dazzling people.
Yeah.
The ultimate example cited is George Washington Vanderbilt's Biltmore.
In Asheville, North Carolina.
That's the one. Designed by Richard Morris Hunt. It's basically a French Renaissance chateau, just dropped into the Appalachian Mountains.
It's unbelievable.
The sheer scale, 250 rooms. It was just an unambiguous statement that the owner had, well, essentially limitless resources and ambition, a real counterpoint to the modesty some neoclassicists were aiming for.
Okay, so moving away from European influence towards styles that felt more, I guess, intrinsically American, styles that tried to connect with the nation's own history.
Yeah, and that's the whole motivation behind what the sources call the indigenous and revival styles.
Okay.
Apparently, the 1876 Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia kicked off this huge wave of national self-awareness, maybe even a kind of patriotic pride. And this feeling, this sense of historical connection, translated directly into the early colonial revival style. That ran roughly from 1885 to about 1915.
So people were trying to recreate the past.
Essentially, yeah. rebuilding an idealized version of the colonial past in their homes.
And then there's a very distinctive regional style that somehow became popular everywhere, the Dutch colonial.
Ah, yes, the Dutch colonial.
Ah.
Flourished between, say, 1890 and 1930. Instantly recognizable, right?
The roof line.
Exactly, the gambrel roof. Unlike a simple gable, it has two slopes on each side.
Right, like a barn roof sometimes.
Sort of, yeah. And the lower slope often flares out a bit at the eaves. The big advantage was it gave you much more usable space upstairs, almost a full second story, without needing tall vertical walls.
Clever.
What's interesting, though, is the American versions often had a longer and steeper upper roof pitch than the original Dutch ones. That kind of distinguished them.
And other detail.
Beyond the roof, yeah, the other details, symmetry, multi-pane windows, they often borrowed directly from the standard colonial revival look.
Okay, and finally, there's this influence from England's picturesque movement. That gave us the Italianate villa.
Right, the Italianate villa. It showed up in the U.S. maybe 2 decades before the Gustave Aimé house example from 1855.
And what was revolutionary about it?
It was really designed for the enjoyment of vistas, of views. It came out of that English picturesque movement where the goal was an informal, kind of secluded setting, very different from the rigid formality of, say, the Georgian style.
So less imposing, more integrated with nature.
Exactly. Italianate homes usually have low-pitched roofs, really wide overhanging eaves, often held up by decorative brackets, and tall, narrow windows. The value was placed on texture, variety, intricate landscaping. The building and the view became almost equally important. The house itself became kind of a frame for the beauty outside.
Yeah. Okay, so if we connect all this back to the bigger picture, all these beautiful, unique house styles, whether they were grand Georgian mansions or these picturesque Italianate villas, they ultimately had to exist within some kind of regulatory structure.
Right. You can't just build anything anywhere.
And the history of that structure zoning, it's fundamentally a story about control, about separation, and frankly, about exclusion.
It's easy now to just think of zoning as, dry rules about minimum lot sizes or where you can put a shop.
Yeah.
But the sources show its roots are global, starting with things like public health concerns.
That's a really key distinction. Early European zoning, especially in French and German cities, was more about pragmatic separation.
Like keeping polluting factories and noxious uses away from where people actually lived. Simple separation.
Makes sense.
The British contribution was more the idea of systematic analysis. They did these comprehensive studies and concluded that, city conditions could be proactively improved if the government stepped in. It was sort of the age of reason applied to the chaos of the industrial city.
But when zoning crossed the Atlantic to the U.S., the justification shifted a bit. It got framed under the government's police powers.
Yeah, the legal basis in the U.S. became police powers. That's the state's inherent authority to legislate to protect public safety, health, and general welfare.
Okay.
But in practice, U.S. zoning developed these two really critical conceptual borders. The first was the obvious one, separating land uses, residential here, commercial there, industrial over there.
Standard stuff.
But the second border, and maybe the one that had the biggest impact on how American cities look and feel, was the border that separated the detached single-family home from every other kind of place to live. That created this foundational split that really valued and protected the single-family house above all other forms.
And this tool, which sounds kind of neutral, was very quickly used as a primary way to enforce segregation and economic isolation.
Precisely. The sources lay out a really clear trajectory of how zoning became a barrier. Even after the Supreme Court, in 1917, struck down a direct Louisville law that assigned blocks as either white or black.
The Buchanan case?
Right. Cities just found workarounds. Indianapolis, for example, passed a rule requiring written consent from a majority of white residents in an area before an African-American family could move in.
Wow.
And they did this even when their own city lawyers advised it was likely unconstitutional.
Yeah.
Just shows the overwhelming local political desire to maintain separation, basically by any means necessary.
And the ultimate example of zoning used just as a hard, isolating barrier has to be that famous case in Blackjack, Missouri.
Oh, the Blackjack case from 1969 is a perfect stark example of what's called defensive incorporation, meaning a church group proposed building a federally subsidized, racially integrated housing complex in this unincorporated part of St. Louis County.
Okay.
In direct response, the local voters rushed to incorporate as their own town, Blackjack. And almost immediately, they adopted a zoning ordinance.
And that ordinance?
It restricted housing density to no more than 3 homes per acre, which of course effectively killed the planned apartment complex.
So it was a transparent use of land use rules to just wall off an advantaged all-white group.
Exactly, to keep out an economically and racially integrated population.
And this kind of structural exclusion wasn't just local town stuff. It was actually federally sanctioned through programs like the HOLC grading system,
Yeah.
redlining.
Yeah, the Homeowners Loan Corporation grading was just a devastating formalized version of racism in real estate. The system explicitly penalized neighborhoods based on perceived racial risk.
Mm,
The sources cite that St. Louis County example again, Lincoln Terrace. The houses there were relatively new, good quality bungalows built in 1927.
physically fine.
Physically fine.
Yeah.
But the neighborhood got the lowest possible D grade, the red line, because the HOLC report stated the area suffered a tremendous decline in values due to the colored element now controlling the district.
Unbelievable, just based on race.
The racial makeup dictated the financial judgment.
Mm-hmm.
Full stop.
Mm-hmm.
And that created this cycle of disinvestment that was incredibly hard to break.
And this whole system, zoning, redlining it, really powered the rise of modern suburbia as we know it.
Well, the idea of the detached house with a big yard, that had been an ideal since after the Civil War. Symbol of security away from the, grime and bustle of the industrial city.
Right.
And those early railroad commuter suburbs definitely set an image of affluence, but there weren't that many of them initially.
And they sometimes joined the city.
Yeah, it's interesting when those wealthy suburbs wanted to be annexed by the central city. It wasn't always just about community spirit. Often it was for very practical things. Getting access to city sewers, better schools, professional police forces.
But the real explosion of suburbia, the massive scale change, that only happened once the car became central to everything.
The car was the absolute catalyst for decentralization. Downtowns are becoming completely unmanageable.
But bad.
The sources mentioned that by 1926, the average late afternoon travel speed on Fifth Avenue in Manhattan had dropped below 3 miles per hour, basically walking pace.
Wow.
So you have that congestion combined with the incredibly favorable loan terms from the FHA and the VA after World War II.
For new houses.
Crucially, yes, for new construction, overwhelmingly in the suburbs, and the direct result was the systematic draining of potential buyers and capital from inner-city housing markets.
So the single-family tract house, backed by this whole financial and regulatory system?
It offered this private haven that older city neighborhoods, starved of investment, just couldn't compete with anymore.
Okay, here's where it gets, I think, really interesting for a lot of listeners. We've talked about the architecture, the regulatory history that shaped our housing stock. Now we pivot to the financial strategies people use to turn this stock into, well, significant long-term wealth.
Right. We're shifting gears now from history to actionable strategy. And the core wealth-building method that the sources highlight for residential investment is known as the BRRRR method.
Buy, rehab, rent, refinance, repeat. And you really stressed that the absolute key, the make-or-break step, is that first buy.
Without a doubt. The success of the entire BRRR strategy hinges on buying properties significantly below market value, usually distressed properties, ones that need a lot of work.
Because that's where the value add comes in.
Exactly. And the ultimate payoff isn't just collecting rent, although that's important. It's really that refinance step.
Explain that.
The goal is you renovate the property successfully, which dramatically increases its appraised value. Then you do a cash-out refinance based on that new, higher valuation.
So you pull money out.
Yes. Ideally, this lets the investor pull all their initial capital back out, sometimes even more. So you effectively end up owning a fully renovated cash-flowing asset for essentially $0 of your own money left in the deal.
Which lets you repeat the process immediately.
Precisely.
Yeah.
You take that capital and go find the next deal.
Now, to make that initial buy and rehab happen quickly, especially on distressed properties, investors often can't use regular bank loans right away. What are the key tools for getting fast cash?
The primary tool for speed in that situation is the hard money loan.
Okay.
These are short-term bridge loans, usually from private lenders, not banks. They're secured by the hard asset itself, the property.
But they're expensive.
Typically, yes, they usually carry pretty high interest rates and fees. That's because the lender's taking on more risk, and the loan term is short, maybe 6 to 18 months.
So what's the upside?
Speed and flexibility. That's crucial when you're bidding on properties that need immediate major repairs, the kind that wouldn't qualify for traditional bank financing anyway.
And then, as an investor starts building a bigger portfolio, say more than just 1 or 2 houses, the financing game changes again.
Oh, completely. Once you grow beyond the 10 conventional mortgages, that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac generally allow an individual,
Right, there's a limit.
you have to start seeking out portfolio loans. This means building relationships with local banks, regional banks, credit unions, institutions that have an appetite for lending to residential investors on a larger scale.
And how are those loans usually structured?
Often they're structured as something like a 51 ARM,
Mm.
an adjustable rate mortgage,
Meaning?
meaning the interest rate is fixed for the first 5 years, which gives you predictability for calculating your cash flow during that initial period. Then, after 5 years, the rate adjusts annually based on market conditions.
So cultivating those banking relationships is key for scaling up.
Absolutely critical for long-term growth, yeah,
Yeah.
because the conventional loan options eventually dry up for active investors.
Okay, let's talk about the biggest multiplier in all of real estate. Leverage. Can you break down that principle and why it's so powerful?
Sure. Leverage is, simply put, using other people's money debt
Mm-hmm.
to increase the potential return on your own cash investment.
Using loans, basically.
Exactly. And the beauty of it, the power, comes when the interest rate you pay on the debt is lower than the property's overall rate of return. When that happens, you magnify your gains significantly.
The sources had a pretty stark example, right?
They did. An all-cash purchase of a property might yield, say, a 9% return on your money. Respectable.
Uh-uh.
But that same property, if purchased with only a small down payment, say $10,000, and using heavy leverage for the rest, that could potentially yield a 20.7% cash-on-cash ROI.
More than double the return on the actual cash you put in.
Exactly. So using leverage strategically is probably the single most important skill for maximizing returns. But you have to do it without taking on, crazy disproportionate risks.
Okay, so you've bought the property, maybe with a hard money loan. Now comes the rehab phase. This seems like a place where investors can really stumble, bad cost estimates, problems with contractors.
It absolutely is. The sources really emphasize that getting the rehab cost estimation right requires using a very rigorous framework, typically called a statement of work, or SOW.
What does that involve?
It forces the investor to detail every single specific task, every material choice, and the cost for each, line by line. You can't just guess.
And costs can vary wildly.
Oh, massively. Based on the level of finishes alone, you might pay $1.50 per square foot for basic vinyl flooring, but solid oak could be $6 per square foot or even more.
Right.
And critically, who you hire matters. A licensed, insured contractor costs significantly more upfront than maybe someone you find on Craigslist.
But they reduce your risk.
Hugely. They mitigate the risk of shoddy work, liens, injuries on site, the whole 9 yards.
And then there's managing the contractors themselves. The sources have this interesting psychological tip: keep them hungry.
Yeah, it sounds a little cynical maybe, but it's really about pragmatic project management.
How so?
If you pay a contractor, say 50% or more of the total job cost right up front, they often lose all sense of urgency. Their motivation drops.
Okay.
So the core principle is to structure payments based on clearly defined, verifiable milestones, like foundation poured, framing complete, drywall up.
Got it. Proof of progress.
Exactly. You provide just enough payment at each stage to keep the contractor solvent and motivated to hit the next benchmark. You're keeping them hungry for the next payment, which maintains speed and ensures they stick to the quality standards you agreed on in the SOW. Your payment schedule is basically your leverage over the work getting done properly and on time.
Makes sense. So the property's renovated, now the investor enters the rent phase and becomes a landlord. What are the absolute must-dos for effective management?
Well, it really starts before they even move in, with rigorous tenant screening.
What does that entail?
You absolutely must verify their credit score, check their rental history for past issues, confirm their employment history and income stability.
There's usually an income requirement, right?
Yeah, a common rule of thumb is demanding proof that the tenant's income is at least 3 times the monthly rent. It shows they can comfortably afford it.
Okay. And after they move in?
Equally essential is discipline management. The sources are really firm on this. You have to strictly and immediately enforce the rules laid out in the lease, especially regarding late rent payment.
No wiggle room.
Very little. If you consistently let late payments slide, even if you feel empathetic, you essentially train the tenant that the due date is flexible. And that often leads to escalating financial problems down the road for both parties. Strict but fair boundaries are just necessary for sound financial stewardship of the property.
Okay, let's shift to the really big benefits, especially around taxes. What are the most powerful tax strategies that are specifically available to real estate investors?
All right, there are 3 huge ones highlighted. First, And maybe the most counterintuitive one is depreciation. It's often called a paper deduction.
Why paper?
Because the IRS lets you deduct the cost of the physical structure, the building itself, not the land value, over a set period, which is 27.5 years for residential rental property.
So you divide the building's cost by 27.5.
Right. If your structure, just the building, is valued at $200,000, you can deduct about $7,272 every single year from your taxable rental income.
Okay, but here's the kicker.
The critical thing is you get this deduction even if the property is actually increasing in market value, appreciating.
Whoa. So you could be making positive cash flow each month. The property value could be going up. But for tax purposes, the government treats it like the building is wearing out, shielding some of that income from taxes.
That's exactly it. It's a huge benefit. Second, there's the relatively new pass-through deduction. It's a big one. It allows the first 20% of certain types of income, including qualified rental income from real estate investments, to be completely tax-free for many investors.
20% just gone from your taxable income.
Under the right conditions, yes. It's a major advantage.
Okay, and the third one, the one you hear about for building serious multi-generational wealth, the 1031 exchange.
Ah, the 1031. This is a real game changer for growing a portfolio over time. What it does is allow you to defer paying capital gains taxes when you sell an investment property.
Okay.
If you reinvest the proceeds into another like-kind investment property, basically swapping one investment property for another.
But there are strict rules, right? It's not just whenever you feel like it.
Oh, very strict. This is key for listeners to understand. You don't get unlimited time. There are two critical deadlines after you sell the first property.
What are they?
First, you must formally identify potential replacement properties within 45 days of closing the sale of your old property.
45 days isn't very long.
It's not. It puts immense pressure on you. And second, you must actually close on the purchase of one or more of those identified properties within 180 days from the original sale date.
Wow. Okay, so that 45-day identification window seems like a huge potential bottleneck. Does the whole strategy kind of rely on the market cooperating, having suitable properties available right when you need them?
It absolutely does. That 4,580-day rule is precisely what elevates the 1031 exchange from just a tax benefit to a high-pressure strategic maneuver.
What happens if you miss the deadlines?
If you miss either deadline, the deferred capital gains tax bill from the original sale becomes due immediately. Poof.
Ouch.
So it forces rapid, decisive action. It's definitely not for the faint of heart or the unprepared.
But what's the ultimate payoff? Why go through all that pressure?
The indefinite deferral is powerful for growth, but the ultimate payoff often comes much later. If the investor holds on to the property acquired through exchanges for their entire life and then passes it on to their heirs, the heirs receive what's called a step-up in basis. This means the property's cost basis for tax purposes is reset to its fair market value at the time of the investor's death.
And the practical effect of that is?
The practical effect is that all those decades of deferred capital gains taxes, they just vanish, completely forgiven. The wealth transfers to the next generation free from all the accumulated income tax liability. It is arguably the single most powerful tool for generational wealth transfer available through real estate. #V, investor psychology, and market reality. So, okay, this brings up a really important question, I think. We've just detailed all these rational strategies, BRRR, 21 exchanges, careful analysis. But real-world success often depends just as much on the investor's ability to stay rational when the market itself, and frankly, human psychology, is anything but.
Right. We're sort of conditioned to believe markets are efficient, that prices reflect all known information. But the sources you provided give, quote, clinching evidence that during speculative bubbles, that efficiency just evaporates.
The late 1920s stock market is a perfect, if painful, case study in what the sources call wide-scale stock market irrationality.
How so?
How else can you possibly explain closed-end investment companies trading at absolutely astronomical premiums over the actual value of the assets they held?
Like the Goldman Sachs example.
Exactly. The Goldman Sachs Trading Corporation at one point was selling for twice its net asset value. Think about that.
So the underlying stocks it owned were worth, say, $1.
Right. The rational value of its holdings, maybe shares of AT&T or whatever, was $1 per unit.
Right.
But the public was feverishly paying $2.50 for that same unit.
Why?
Purely speculative enthusiasm. Fear of missing out. FOMO. That's the absolute definition of a market totally disconnected from fundamental value.
And sometimes this irrationality is actually fueled, or at least not dampened, by the very people we look to for guidance, the financial analysts.
Yeah, that's the classic problem of analyst bias. It's a huge conflict of interest.
Explain that conflict.
Well, analysts traditionally issue very few sell recommendations on stocks. Why? Because their investment banks often provide lucrative services underwriting IPOs, advising on mergers to the very companies the analysts are supposed to be objectively covering.
So they don't want to anger a potential client.
Precisely. Yeah. They're incentivized to be friendly, or at least not overly critical. This reached an absurd peak during the dot-com internet bubble.
How bad did it get?
The ratio of buy recommendations to sell recommendations from Wall Street analysts climbed to something like 100 to 1.
100 buys for every one sell.
Yes. It strongly indicated that many analysts were effectively being paid to be cheerleaders, to be relentlessly bullish, regardless of the underlying financial reality of these companies.
So let's contrast that speculative craziness with the more sober, data-driven approach that the sources suggest actually works over the long haul.
Right, and that brings us to value investing. The data, looked at over long periods, consistently shows that building a portfolio of stocks bought when they have relatively low earnings multiples.
A low price-to-earnings ratio, or PE.
Exactly, a low PE ratio. That strategy tends to produce above-average returns even after you adjust for risk.
So despite the market going nuts sometimes.
Despite the periodic descents into madness, yeah. A fundamentally sound, rational investment approach focused on intrinsic value, what a company is actually worth based on its earnings and assets, tends to win out eventually. It just requires discipline and patience.
Okay, let's pivot now to the investor's own mind. Sticking to these rational strategies, especially when things get volatile, requires really good habit formation, overcoming our own psychological barriers.
Absolutely. Habits are, at their core, just automatic solutions our brain develops for recurring problems or situations.
So why do we fail so often to adopt good habits, like sticking to an investment plan?
Often it's because our intentions are what the sources call foggy notions. We want to eat better, or save more money, or analyze deals more thoroughly. But those are vague concepts, not concrete actions.
So what's the fix?
The behavioral science solution presented is using what's called an implementation intention. It's a specific formula. I will behavior at time in location.
Can you give an example for an investor?
Sure. Instead of vaguely wanting to analyze more deals, you'd say, I will review new property listings on the MLS for 30 minutes at 7 a.m. in my home office every Monday and Wednesday.
Ah, very specific.
That specificity transforms the vague desire into an executable, almost automated plan. It lowers the mental barrier to actually doing it.
Okay, now let's apply this kind of psychological insight to the really sharp end of the business negotiation. Getting that distressed property deal or securing favorable financing terms. How would behavioral tactics help there?
Negotiation is so much about controlling emotions, yours and theirs, and managing expectations. The biggest barrier to reaching an agreement is often some unaddressed fear or skepticism simmering under the surface on the other side.
Things they're worried about, but maybe not saying.
Exactly. And you absolutely have to move those negatives out into the open, because just ignoring them or denying them only gives them more power in the background.
And the specific technique mentioned for doing this is called the accusation audit.
Yes, exactly. The accusation audit. It involved you proactively listing out the worst things the other party could possibly be thinking or saying about you, your offer, or the deal itself. You say them first.
How would that sound in practice?
You might start a negotiation by saying something like, look, you probably think I'm coming in way too low with this offer. You might think I'm just trying to steal this property, that my financing isn't solid, and maybe that I'm going to try and nickel and dime you on repairs after the inspection.
You just lay it all out there.
You lay out all their potential fears and criticisms right at the start. By voicing their worst fears for them, you diffuse the emotional charge behind those concerns.
And what happens then?
Often, because hearing the accusations voiced aloud can make them sound a bit exaggerated, the other person feels almost compelled to counter them. They might say, well, no, it's not that bad. Or even offer positive claims about you to correct the record. It helps stabilize the emotional tone and encourages collaboration instead of defensiveness.
But ultimately, the investor still has to maintain control, right? Which means being genuinely willing to walk away from a bad deal.
You absolutely must internalize what the sources call the ready-to-walk mindset. It's fundamental. No deal is always better than a bad deal.
Easier said than done sometimes.
It is, because deals can feel personal or you feel scarcity. But if you feel compelled to accept an unfavorable outcome simply because you're afraid of losing the opportunity entirely, you've essentially taken yourself hostage in the negotiation.
So you need firm boundaries.
You have to maintain strong, clear boundaries limits on what you'll accept. But do it with empathy, understanding their position too. Crucially, though, you must do it without ever showing neediness or desperation. The greatest source of leverage in any negotiation comes from the other side, believing you are authentically willing to walk away if your needs aren't met. Hashtag tag 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 Shevin. Conclusion and provocative thought.
So after all that, what does this complex picture really mean? We've covered a huge amount of ground here, charting this journey from, the symbolic, symmetric Federalist doorways back in 1824, representing early American ambition,
No,
all the way through the often ugly history of exclusionary zoning, and then right up to modern, sophisticated investment returns using things like leverage and PAN 31 exchanges.
yeah, the synthesis is incredibly powerful, and I agree with you. Frankly, it's pretty sobering when you see it all laid out. The aesthetic value, the character of our built environment, the very houses we live in or admire, they are just inextricably linked to the policies and the financial decisions, both historic and modern, that created them and sustained them.
And the success of an investor today.
Whether they're using BRRRR or skillfully navigating a 1031 exchange, it really relies on systematic thinking, a clear-eyed, rational view of market realities, all built on top of a foundation of regulatory history that, as we saw, was often explicitly designed for exclusion and separation.
It is kind of a chilling realization, isn't it? That these huge, often impersonal forces of finance and regulation ultimately shape and constrain perhaps the most personal decision we make, where we get to live. We talked about the history of racial zoning, how it was used to create literal physical barriers to isolate certain groups, usually advantaged white groups.
Indeed. And we know from other research hinted at in the sources that today the intense clustering of, say, high-earning creative class talent in so-called superstar cities drives extreme economic segregation. And that segregation is often fueled by the relentless pursuit of maximized, often highly leveraged returns on appreciating urban land and property values. The result is that the wealthy increasingly isolate themselves, not just physically behind gates maybe, but financially behind enormous cost barriers.
So here's the final thought we want to leave you with. Considering that history, the historic use of zoning to create visible physical and racial boundaries, what kind of new, maybe invisible financial boundaries are being built or reinforced today?
Boundaries that are just as constraining, like the extraordinary, often leveraged cost of urban land and housing. Are these being reinforced by the very sophisticated investment strategies like maximizing leverage, using 1031s to defer taxes indefinitely, that are designed solely to maximize financial return?
What is the long-term impact when the most successful investment strategies inherently favor appreciation and potentially exclusion? What does the successful widespread deployment of high leverage and perpetual tax deferral ultimately do to the character, the accessibility, and maybe even the equity of our built environment over time?
That's really the challenge for you, the listener, to maybe mull over. The next time you're walking through a beautiful historic neighborhood or maybe admiring a rapidly gentrifying area, ask yourself, beyond the visible bricks and mortar, what invisible financial forces, what investment strategies are powerfully at work today, shaping who gets to live there now and who might be able to afford it in the future?